hashtag youth homelessness, or hashtag state index 2022. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my co-presenter, Aleya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aleya Jones, she, her pronouns. I am the Senior Officer of State Policy at True Colors United. As you can see here, our advocacy division at TCU is a small and mighty team, but I'm joined with wonderful colleagues, Whitney Bunce and Timothy Hale, and I'm really happy to be here. And thank you all for spending time with us. I know the holidays are right around the corner, but we're really appreciated for you for attending. And I'll pass it over to Jeremy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Penn. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the interim youth attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. We are joined today by my wonderful supervisor at Katie Meyer-Scott, who is the senior youth attorney at the Law Center and heads our youth team. And I also want to give a shout out to Eric Tars, our legal director, and Erica Lopez, our communications associate, who have been infallible to us and who are unfortunately not on the call today, but are wishing all of you well. And with that, I'm going to briefly turn the mic back over to Katie.
Just want to take a moment to remember a colleague who is not with us here today, Gabriela Sevilla. This index project was something that was super meaningful to her. Some of you on the call may have known her or interacted with her last year. She tragically died this year in October, and we are just feeling her loss. And so just wanted to take a moment to just think of her and to kind of let you all know that this project and the advocacy that comes out of it, it's truly her legacy. This is what she cared about so much. And so we are just doing this in honor of her today. So thank you all for the love in the chat. We really appreciate it.
And to continue honoring Gabby really cared about us sharing our why behind joining this work. So I'll start and share a bit of my story. I want to name that I do not have a lived experience of being unhoused. The passion I have for this work comes from being Black and queer. And when I heard about True Colors United, I thought the alignment was really interesting because when I was in college, I founded an organization called Colors, and it was for students of color that were also queer to have a space to organize, to be in community, to be activists. And when I heard the title True Colors United and I knew of the work that this organization did, I just felt like I was being called to the work into the space. So I thank you all for letting me join you on this fight to end youth homelessness. And I'll pass it to Jeremy to share a little more of her story.
Like Aleya said, we want to center our why a bit in this space and bring the humanity that we have to the work that we do. I also do not have any lived experience with homelessness or growing up unhoused. I did grow up in a verbally and occasionally physically abusive household. I came out as gay in high school and then trans again in college. And I wanted to include a photo of the office for Spectrum, which was the LGBTQ organization that I was lucky enough to have as a resource for me in college and then served as president for. It's where I was radicalized into racial justice and abolition work. And it's this space that ultimately led to me going to law school and ending up here at the Law Center.
Thanks so much for sharing, Jeremy. So we're going to hop into our objectives, right? So again, we want to welcome you to the 2022 State Index on Youth Homelessness. Both Jeremy and I are super excited to share our findings and results, plans for upcoming changes in future reports. And we have also included some of our policy priorities that advocates can work on in 2023. Our ultimate hope is that you will walk away inspired and join us in this fight to end youth homelessness. So I want to first start this presentation by pointing out our why behind this work and this report specifically. Unhoused youth face numerous legal and systemic barriers that complicate or prevent their access to critical supports and services like shelter, medical care, public benefits, and education. If we can ensure that services are safe for and affirming of the most impacted young people, we can be confident that they'll be safe and affirming for everyone. We believe that youth homelessness is a community issue, and Real change can happen when people come together with a shared vision. So I'm going to spend some time going over the methodology of our report. So the index evaluates each state in the District of Columbia's investments towards preventing and ending youth homelessness by reviewing certain metrics and benchmarks across laws and policies, systems, and environments. We want to emphasize that a high score on the index doesn't necessarily indicate that state government is effectively addressing these issues. Many states that earn high scores on the index face extraordinary challenges in addressing homelessness within their state lines for reasons that are not captured by the index, including the state's broader economic policies, economic climate, and community level approaches to homelessness and housing supply issues. We also want to make sure that we are clear in stating that the index measures a state's structure to eliminate youth homelessness in general. We are not measuring whether or not a state is effectively implementing those said laws and policies, or if they are reducing the number of youth experiencing homelessness. However, we believe that the index is a useful starting place for young people, providers, and advocates and policymakers to ensure their state has the prerequisite policies, both in writing and effect, that they'll need to redirect some of the most common pipelines to youth homelessness towards housing for all. So the metrics and benchmarks measured in the state index are indicative of a state's overall approach towards ending youth homelessness. We're trying to understand if states have created coordinated efforts to youth homelessness services. We stand behind all of the law and policy metrics included in the report, such as calling out why definitions need to be adopted, and they, along with relevant laws and policies, need to be more inclusive, developmentally and culturally appropriate, and youth-centric in order to support unhoused youth who seek publicly funded services. We're measuring whether a state is proactively working towards ending the criminalization of unhoused youth to prevent harmful criminal records that could impede future career goals and housing stability. We're also looking to see if all states ensure access to education for unhoused youth. Communities should work with schools to ensure youth experiencing homelessness have access to safe, adequate, and appropriate transportation, and that school policies accommodate the needs of these students. And lastly, we're also looking to make sure that states are reducing and eliminating barriers to food and financial support that will enable unhoused youth the opportunity to grow and reach financial and housing stability. In regard to our systems and environments, right, we are making sure that harm reduction makes the process easier for youth to navigate the system. So we're tracking whether or not states have a state entity, such as an Office of Homeless Youth Services, homeless youth state coordinators, or a commissioner on youth homelessness that focuses solely on designing, implementing, and evaluating youth homelessness programs. By creating this kind of state entity, public officials can assure that there is adequate capacity, subject matter expertise, and prioritization of youth services necessary to make a significant impact. We're also looking to make sure that protections are in place against discrimination for youth who are seeking services, such as implementing policies that ban controversial and ineffective services for LGBTQ youth, such as conversion therapy, and creating a statewide strategy to prevent and end youth homelessness that is inclusive of LGBTQ youth. Increasing access and trust in these services for LGBTQ youth is critical to support ending youth homelessness. So more on our grading system, right? So out of a possible 100 points, over half of the points are distributed across 13 key metrics, which are indicative of a state's overall approach towards youth homelessness. The remaining metrics, grouped by law and policy, systems, and environments, were weighted equally. The metrics are researched first by a team of pro bono attorneys who score state statutes, regulations, and plans for relevant information. After the first round of research, initial findings are sent out to key stakeholders, who I know some of you are on this call, for review, feedback, and corrections. I'm now going to pass it over to Jeremy to go over some of the key results and findings.
And Jeremy luckily remembered to unmute herself. So this is a I'm gonna walk us through the results and findings from the 2022 state index, and this is just a brief overview of how all of the states scored this past year. And it can look really bad, right? It does look really bad. Only 7 states received a passing score. Over half of them received a low score. 17 states, which is more than the number who passed, received a critically low score. And so I think, especially for those who are experiencing homelessness and for those who are doing the advocacy work to end homelessness, we can feel a sense of despair when we see a graph like this. And I want to flip that on its head for us. So I'm going to paraphrase Angela Davis and say that walls turned sideways are bridges. And everywhere that we have a problem and there is a barrier to getting youth who are experiencing homelessness housed, we have an opportunity to get them housed. And with that, I will go to the next slide. Thank you, Aleya, because I think you're the one still. Yep. This is just a comparison between 2021 and 2022. I want to note that some of the changes between the previous year's index and this year's, a number of those changes are substantive, right? There was a statute that was passed or amended or repealed. There was a change in policy by the executive branch, so on and so forth. Some of the changes are due to improve research quality. So with better research and a more in-depth review of everything that's available to us, it was, oh, actually, this state is doing really well on something we marked them as having done wrong previously, or the other way around. We thought a state was doing really well on a particular metric, and actually they're failing really severely. And so the index, as Aleya said, provides a snapshot of laws, policies, systems, and environments. And I want to note that a low score on the index does not mean that a state is not doing a lot of work to try and end youth homelessness. And likewise, a high score does not mean that a state is succeeding per se. There are a lot of factors that impact the rates of homelessness on the ground, whether that is broader economic issues, housing supply issues, and their community level approaches. And so there's a lot that goes into this. And what we are capturing are the systems that are in place and whether or not those systems are adequately prepared to respond to and address youth homelessness. So here we have a breakdown of our scoring system. So law and policy is overwhelmingly the majority of where we focus on the state index. So 65 of the 100 points are in law and policy. 0 states, none of them, received a perfect score this year. And the lowest scores were Arkansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Carolina, and South Dakota. Systems and environment, 18 points and 17 points respectively. Only 1 state got a perfect score on systems, and that's Washington. Shout out to Katie, who is based in Washington State. And only 1 state managed to get a perfect score in environment, and that was California. A number of states had the lowest scores or tied for the lowest score for systems and environment. You can see them there. I will not read through them all. There's a lot of them. But needless to say that every state in the country has work that is available for the people who are living there to get to doing in 2023. No state is perfect, and every state there are opportunities to make changes that will better the lives of people involved, of youth experiencing homelessness. I wanted to run through the meat of our work here. So we've been talking about all of these metrics. What are they? Notable findings. So a few things we wanted to highlight. Emancipation. 18 states, and that includes DC, do not have a codified emancipation process. Not having a codified emancipation process makes emancipation really, really difficult to access without an attorney. And so having a codified emancipation process is a key metric that we would love to see tackled over the next legislative session in the 18 states and DC where it doesn't already exist. Consent to mental health care. There are still 9 states that do not allow youth to consent to mental health care without parental consent, and 18 states that do not allow youth to consent to treatment for sexual assault without parental consent. And these are, like really basic. What we want to see as the broadest approach is a blanket opportunity for youth to consent to their own health care without parental consent. But these are key pieces of accessing healthcare that we want to see that need for parental consent set aside. Something we wanted to highlight, though, that was a wonderful opportunity that we've seen over like many years and decades of advocacy, is that every state and DC has established an age of childhood that encompasses people who are older than 18, which means that when we talk about homeless youth or youth that are unhoused, we're not only talking about those who are under 18, we're talking about people who have been experiencing that homelessness and then like don't magically become grown-ups who know what they're doing the instant the clock strikes midnight and they get Cinderella into a legal adult. That folks still are in need of resources and investment and housing, even when they cease to be a youth in the typical sense of the word. And so we're really excited that every jurisdiction has established some sort of definition of childhood that encompasses people beyond simply minors. Rounding out our law and policy highlights, we also have the right to contract. A lot of states have the right to contract. They get credit for the right to contract on our metric when the only contracting rights that minors have are for life and health insurance. And only about 20 states in the country allow youth to contract specifically for housing and shelter, which means that in 30 states and DC, they don't have the ability to do that, right? Even if a youth is homeless, they can't sign a lease. They can't sign paperwork to enter a shelter, right? They don't have a right to contract. And so that is a huge, huge barrier to accessing housing in the most direct sense of the word. And Nebraska is the only state that does not allow any right to contract for minors whatsoever. So that rounds out law and policy. You'll notice everything is nice and color-coded. Systems, which are in green, we have two we wanted to highlight. Tuition waivers. Every state in the country, including DC as well, provides at least $5,000 a year in vouchers for current and former foster youth. What we want to see are full tuition waivers for all foster and unhoused youth. That to us is a really, really fantastic a goal for us to be aiming for as advocates that would make a huge difference in access to education for youth who are unhoused and youth who have been involved in the foster care system. And lastly, proof of residency. Only 26 states allow youth to access state ID without parental consent, which means that in 24 or 25 of them, we count DC as a state, and I'm not sure which one it falls into here. In 25 jurisdictions, youth can't access a state ID without parental consent, which means they have no way of providing an ID, whether that's to access education, to access shelter or housing, to, again, for health insurance, for employment, for all of those resources listed there, including public benefits. And I also wanted to flag, Aleya and I focus a lot on where this work intersects with the barriers that LGBTQ youth experience. And so there are a number of states where there are barriers to having the proper gender marker on one's state ID, especially as a youth. And there are a lot of jurisdictions that do not yet allow a non-binary gender marker as well. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide. And these are just a couple highlights. Some of these things we talked about, right? Only 7 out of the 51 jurisdictions earned a passing grade of 70 or higher. Two things we also wanted to highlight, which are that only 24 states allow homeless youth to use SNAP to buy hot restaurant or prepared meals. This is a really major issue, especially for youth who are in some sort of dormitory setting or are in a shelter and they don't have access to a kitchen space. They don't have a way to prepare their own food because they have no space or, stove, refrigerator, et cetera, to do so. And so not having access to SNAP still runs into a barrier where, okay, great, they have access to SNAP, but they can't actually spend it on something that's useful, right? They can buy groceries, but they don't have anywhere to prepare that produce. And so we want to both get youth into housing where they have the ability to do that, where they have a kitchen and space to cook, but we also want them to have access to hot restaurant and prepared meals, right? Because we know that that first one is going to take a long time to get done. And in the meantime, we have homeless youth who need food. And the last one, again, Aleya mentioned this earlier, conversion therapy is something that we have our eyes on. over the next year. Only 21 states have a full ban on conversion therapy for minors. And I also want to flag for advocates who are on the call that as of right now, the 11th Circuit, which the Federal Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, which covers Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, has actually banned bans on conversion therapy on the grounds that it's a First Amendment violation. This is something we are watching very closely, but we would like to see changes on this front. This is a very high profile, a very high priority issue for us because conversion therapy is deeply, deeply destructive to LGBTQ youth. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and pass the mic back over to Aleya to go over our recommendations and calls to action.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. So some of the key takeaways that we wanted to highlight for you all is that we need to enact comprehensive laws that create and coordinate prevention, right, identification, and early intervention services for unhoused youth. We need to remove barriers for emancipation. We need to allow partial and alternative school credit accrual for unhoused youth. And we need to make sure that unhoused youth can access and consent to their own healthcare. We have identified these 5 takeaways as priorities, and we hope that as you're listening, you also see like why these are so essential for unhoused youth. In terms of system and environments, these are a couple of the key takeaways that we want you to walk away with. One of them is definitely just like strengthening and enforcing protections against discrimination for unhoused youth who identify as LGBTQ. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because something we've identified within the state index, there's a few missing metrics to really like focus in on how destructive and discriminatory so many laws and policies are towards LGBTQ young people. So as you all may know, right, in 2022, there was a terrible wave of cruel and inhumane laws introduced or passed that leave LGBTQ youth even more vulnerable to homelessness. Examples include mandating school employees to out trans children and youth to their parents, banning gender-affirming healthcare, such as puberty blockers, and even removing trans children and youth from loving and supportive homes by redefining best practices in gender-affirming healthcare as child abuse. These policies are inhumane. They violate the basic human rights of self-expression and self-determination that all people share. Trans youth in particular are disproportionately represented among young people experiencing homelessness, and any policy which places them in increasingly hostile social or family environments increases their risk of housing insecurity. A few weeks ago, I went to a conference and the keynote speaker made a point that I found really relevant to this slide. They said something along the lines of, "We are all living in our own stories, a story you're lucky your community affirms." I know that having a community by my side who loves and supports me just as I am goes a very long way, especially when society may tell me different. Affirmations, dignity, and safety go hand in hand. In order to effectively address youth homelessness, stand behind harm reduction metrics, we must be willing to call out and stand against incredibly harmful and discriminatory political rhetoric towards LGBTQ communities. While the index doesn't currently account for these policies among its 61 metrics, lawmakers and advocates should expect to see changes in their state's future scores should this trend continue. So I'm gonna close this out by sharing what our 4 priorities are that we encourage state and local advocates to champion in their communities. So first, we want to codify state level coordination of services for unhoused youth, which can provide critical infrastructure and funding to programs dedicated to ending youth homelessness. Second, we want each state to implement policies that reduce unhoused youth interactions with the juvenile and criminal justice legal system, such as repealing or reforming curfew laws and decriminalizing truancy and running away. Our third priority is to support young people's dreams. And I really want to, again, uplift Gabby here because this was a priority that she deeply cared about, right? We want each state to achieve true access to higher education for unhoused youth. And then finally, we want states to improve enforcement of federal non-discrimination policies for unhoused LGBTQ youth to ensure that they receive culturally competent services free of harassment and abuse. These are just a few of the many issues that advocates can leverage the index for in their communities to hold those in power accountable and demand change. So the full report is now available on our website. You can go to youthstateindex.com where you can find more information about all of the metrics included, recommendations for your state, and more information about our plans for upcoming reports. I want to spend some time showing you all a snippet of what you'll find in the report and on the website, right? So in the report and on the website, you'll actually find your state ranking, and you'll see how it compares to other states as well. You'll see a performance breakdown, right, where we give you all the opportunity to compare the overall score of 2022 to 2021 and see what the improvements are, but also what the highlights are. We try to break down our highlights and recommendations by law and policy, systems and environments so that it's very clear what your state can do to help us end youth homelessness. And the website is also the same. You'll see an overall map where you can locate your state and see how it ranks, right? Did it get a high score? Did it get a low score? Did it get a critically low score? And then again, you will see the breakdown of metrics, like what percentage did your state do to meet the full metric? So we hope that these resources are helpful for you as you think about some of the priorities that you have for the next year. And with that, I'll open the floor to any questions that may have come up.
I just wanted to come off mute and highlight, one issue we don't adequately cover in the index, and this is something to think about for the future, but a lot of the things we track are not even available to youth who are undocumented or who have immigration statuses that don't qualify for, state or federal benefits. And so that is something, it's an area for improvement and growth of the index. But I did just want to highlight that as that did come up in the chat and I wanted to address it.
Yeah. And I wanted to quickly piggyback off of Katie here and say that our goal and vision for the future of the index is to actually switch away from this structure of an annual report and move to a live tracking model where we can actually have, to some extent in real time, what is happening, like the state of these issues in each jurisdiction and what is happening, right? What bills are being introduced, what bills have been passed, and also give us the flexibility to add in new metrics that we have not previously been tracking, because it's very difficult to do that in the annual report model, but it's very easy if we switch over to a live tracking model to then go in, do the research and add that new metric in. And I say new, the metric is new in the sense that we're going to be adding these things into the structure of the state index, but the issues have been around for years and years and decades, right? And so it's really about rendering them visible for the first time, not simply introducing them as new.
And I want to add here, because I know that the advocacy team at TCU has been talking about how important it is to center youth voice within this work, right? Like folks who have lived experience to, when you're reviewing the report and you're looking at the metrics, is give us feedback. What are we missing? What do you want to see? Because we cannot do this work without you. So if anyone's in this presentation and has feedback for us, please shoot us an email. The next slide will have our contact information, because we would love to hear from you and collaborate and do this work all together.
Just wanted to note in the chat, someone would love to see Alice would love to see metrics on access to affordable housing. And then also kind of to Aleya, your point, the suggestion that there could be a way for youth to like report issues that they're having. And it could be kind of cool, like whether just email us, but if we have something integrated maybe into the website, like a form or something for youth to report. And yes, Alice, definitely metrics should be reviewed by youth action boards. This was sort of our initial hope of like trying to pay youth for their time here, to kind of get introduced to this project. And we're hoping to work more closely with you all in the coming year as we are trying to improve and update these metrics. So thank you for that. It is exactly what we're thinking about as well. There was also in the Q&A section just a note that it would be great if we could eventually connect the index metrics to how implementation is actually going, like how are people doing on the ground. And I noted in that Q&A, like that is 100% something that we are planning for. Some of the challenges there are just getting like accurate data around youth and young adult homelessness, and so that we can really accurately figure out like, is this policy actually working, or what effect is it having? So just wanted to call that out as well.
So I know we're in Q&A. I see there's at least one hand up.
Oh, yes.
Amy, I don't know how to take someone's question using in the webinar format. I don't know what the right thing to do here would be.
You mean for the person with the hand raised, or
Mhm.
because the Q&A is, let me see who it is. Whoever raised their hand can feel free to like type in the chat, or because I'm not seeing where the hand. Oh, if you want, I can allow you to talk if you want to say your question out loud, or you can type in the chat, whatever works best for you, Keisha, I believe.
Yeah, and for everyone else too, whether you want to, oh, got it. Thank you. You are definitely on the right chat. And feel free to add anything to the Q&A, put something in the chat. It seems like we are ready to move on to the next section of the presentation, but feel free to keep asking questions and we will keep answering them.
Absolutely. And I'm going to move off of monitoring the chat and leave that up to my colleagues here, Jeremy and Aleya. I am now going to share my screen. We're just going to do a section that gives us sort of a quick kind of practical walkthrough of how these metrics show up in real life. So just give me a second here. We're going to start the slideshow from this current slide, and let me hide myself so I can actually see the words on the screen. Okay, just making sure, can anyone put in the chat, like if they can't see the PowerPoint on my screen? All right, not hearing anything. I will assume that everyone can see. Okay, so we're going to follow a 17-year-old transgender youth named Summer. Summer was kicked out by their family and spent the weekend at a friend's house. But the friend isn't actually willing to ask their parents if they can stay long term. Plus, Summer isn't sure if they could get in trouble for having her there. And I bring this up on the very first slide because you think, why in the world would the parents get in trouble? But harboring a runaway is actually a crime in 23 states. So it is, in fact, a concern that is reasonable for youth to worry about in this situation. So we're going to move on and kind of follow some issues that Summer might face trying to figure out how to access housing and shelter. So hopefully I can actually move the PowerPoint along. Oh, why? Oh, maybe it's down here. There we go. Okay, so sometimes when we have a little more time, I would actually have folks vote on which path we're going to take, but instead we're just kind of going to go through and look at some of the options. So let's say that Summer is trying to access staying in a youth shelter. So the youth shelter in this case, luckily has space, but they don't allow pets. Summer is lucky to have her dog Buddy with her. And doesn't feel safe without Buddy. The youth shelter essentially says the solution is they can call an animal shelter to come pick up Buddy, but there's no guarantee to get Buddy back if Summer leaves. So at this point, Summer is faced with an impossible choice. Do you give up Buddy and stay at the shelter or sleep outside? We're going to go on the outside path actually, we'll stick with the shelter path just for now, especially since we're not voting. But basically, before deciding about Buddy, there's one more consideration. The shelter is required by law to promptly notify parents, or if there's evidence of abuse or neglect, the police and CPS when a person under 18 is seeking shelter. Summer doesn't want them to contact their parents and really does not want them to contact the police. And this is something that we track in the metrics, basically whether or not a state allows a delay of notification requirements. And that essentially would mean, like, can a shelter just allow a youth to stay and stabilize for a couple of days before having to immediately reach out to parents or reach out to some kind of state agency or law enforcement? And unfortunately, 29 states do not allow this delay. So it's a real catch-22 for youth. We're going to stick with this path. Summer is deciding, fine, I will stay at the shelter. And I don't know why there we go. Okay. So the shelter notifies the police and Child Protective Services that Summer's at the shelter, possible victim of abuse or neglect. However, in contacting the police, the shelter finds out that Summer has an outstanding warrant for shoplifting. So Summer is arrested and taken to juvenile detention. But then, after determining Summer has nowhere to go, the whole process, like the police, all they can do at that point is contact child welfare and take Summer back to the shelter. So here we are again, just kind of going through the same loop. I did want to go and sort of talk a little bit about the issues if Summer were to try to actually stay outside. Generally, this is going to lead to a situation putting Summer at risk of interaction with law enforcement, being in the park after curfew. Curfew is something that we are looking at right now at the Law Center, not only for states to change laws about curfews, whether that's just repealing curfew laws, whether it is trying to make sure that unhoused youth are exempt from curfew enforcement. We still don't find that to be a great solution because who is making that determination about whether a youth is unhoused? It tends to be police officers in that situation. So not a great solution. But we are also looking at potential jurisdictions where curfews are so egregious, meaning that they are so restrictive that they could potentially be subject to a lawsuit. So we are taking a look at some of those jurisdictions right now. Some places like curfew is as early as 10 p.m., plus saying that you can't be, outside during the day if it's school hours, things like that. So just really an excuse to criminalize youth, and we are not standing for it at the Law Center. One thing I just want to go back, an issue sometimes youth find themselves in is, okay, the shelter is not an option. You can't keep your pet with you. You can't stay with a person that you're necessarily, with at the time. You also don't want to stay outside. So maybe you find a situation where, you have an older acquaintance that has some kind of house that you can stay in. And so you decide to do that. But then you find that it's not an ideal situation for you. And, you get into a situation where, what do you do then? You feel like the shelter is not an option. Outside is not an option. And so you stay in a situation that is unsafe or uncomfortable. And then when you actually, if you share that with someone, especially someone who's a mandated reporter, like a school counselor, like caseworker, the solution there is to potentially contact Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services then may intervene. Maybe they are able to authorize you to stay at a youth shelter for a while. Maybe they're able to engage in like family reconciliation services or figure out like a kinship care option. But the reality in many states is that Child Protective Services does not even prioritize teenagers for services. Like they won't even open a case for someone who is 16 or 17 years old. So literally, you're left without any option for someone to be able to kind of navigate some of those issues of where you could actually be sheltered or let alone housed. So that's kind of where we end up with Summer is sort of in this loop of, can Summer Summer doesn't have the ability in this particular state to consent on their own to shelter. They're kind of in a loop. Maybe the Child Protective Services system agrees to authorize Summer to stay at the shelter. Maybe Summer decides to stay at a place that she doesn't feel 100% safe in, just because it's the best of many bad options. But I want to flip this a little bit now and maybe talk about it from the perspective of, like, let's say Summer actually has a case manager who is trying to navigate these systems and figure out how to get Summer into some kind of stable housing. So we're going to switch to the case manager, choose your own adventure at this point. Okay. So you're a case manager at a youth shelter. Summer is your client, essentially abandoned at the shelter by parents and CPS, been at the shelter for a week and the clock is ticking. And this is because generally shelter programs have a 30-day limit. Some of that is due to federal law. Some state law could also be involved there. Summer has a state ID, but it does not match her name or gender identity. She has a pending charge for shoplifting. She's managing to get to school most days, which is a miracle considering everything that's been going on, but is struggling with depression. When asked what her goals are, Summer states she just wants to get Buddy back and maybe live in her own apartment. She's interested in getting a job or participating in job training, but way too overwhelmed to manage it on top of everything else. So as a caseworker, do you try to deal with the legal problems first, things like ID and warrant, try to find a placement for Summer in a transitional housing program for teens, and then deal with the legal issues and mental health issues, or try to help Summer access mental health care? A lot of times when we do this, people choose transitional housing first. And so we'll go there first. Unfortunately, all the transitional or longer term housing programs will not accept a youth with a warrant and require that youth have a birth certificate, social security card, and state ID. So essentially, we're in a situation here where, while housing first might be a great option in theory, in practice, the states are not making that, or the programs are not making that possible. So let's go back. In that case, generally then people think, okay, well, let's try to deal with the legal problems first. So sometimes you might have a legal aid attorney who is connected with your shelter program or drop-in center. And in this case, luckily, that is the case. So Summer is able to meet with them and begin the name and gender marker change process and the process of quashing her warrant. But after speaking with the attorney, Summer decides she wants to pursue emancipation so that she can live independently. You're worried that Summer is not ready to live independently. So do you help Summer access public assistance so she has a source of income for emancipation? Try to determine if there's a safe person in Summer's life that she could live with, emancipated or not? Or encourage Summer to try to re-engage with CPS so that she'll be eligible for extended foster care benefits when she turns 18. Not surprisingly, hardly anyone chooses the re-engage with CPS option, but we will go there first, just as an example. Oh, except that my link isn't working, so we're not going to go there. We'll just go to whatever the next slide is. All right, that's the public assistance slide. So, unfortunately, the only benefits that are available are for parenting youth. So something like TANF, or potentially for disabled youth, SSI. If Summer lived with a relative or even an unrelated adult, they could possibly apply for child-only TANF and food assistance. Summer might be able to access those benefits directly, but it almost always is going to require some kind of help, like with an attorney or otherwise, to actually navigate the bureaucracy of trying to access those kind of public benefits when you are under 18. Many caseworkers at those agencies are just not trained to even know that youth under 18 should be able to access some of those benefits. So this is a real problem and something that is going to essentially prevent Summer from being able to access income in that way. We can take a look at whether or not there might be a safe person for Summer to live with. Summer mentions the friend that she stayed with when she was first kicked out, but unfortunately, your state does not have a host homes program or only allows host homes as an option for youth over 18. Host homes is something that you may have heard of. It is one thing that we think about when we're trying to, can we get a system where we expand and have lots and lots of different housing options for youth? It's essentially not quite to the level of a foster home, but essentially like a family that has house room, like they have a spare bedroom that they are willing to let an older teen or young adult live in while they get on their feet. And so that is something that unfortunately is not an option for Summer. Summer does mention that they have an older cousin that lives in the area. But unfortunately, the state has, while they have a process for kinship care, which essentially is something that's usually through a state system, through the child welfare system, and says that if you can find a relative that you can stay with, that would sort of be approved by the child welfare system, then you can stay there, and then the state is supposed to be providing, variety of supports to stay with that person. But if the child welfare system isn't even opening a case for Summer, it makes it very difficult for that to be an accessible option. One thing I wanted to kind of go through is sort of this option of if Summer is actually able to get a case open with the child welfare system. In this case, CPS would work out an agreement for Summer to stay with her adult cousin and provide the cousin support. But then in practice, like the cousin did not live in the same school district that Summer was currently going to. So now Summer has missed several weeks of school while the caseworker and the school district try to get transportation set up. Summer is at this point isolated from her friends. CPS does not provide the promised support to her cousin. There's only been one check-in and 0 return calls in the 4 months that Summer has lived there. Summer still has not been able to access mental health care, can't find an LGBTQ affirming therapist that actually takes state health insurance, and things are reaching a crisis point. And so this is where, we kind of get back to the thing. If Summer leaves her cousin's house at this point, we're sort of back in the loop of, what are the possible options? The other thing I just wanted to flag, we mentioned it in the training, that if you as the caseworker decided that the first step was to get Summer access to mental health care, we sometimes run into this problem that youth under 18 cannot even consent to their own mental health treatment. And there's no guarantee, of course, that records are kept confidential from parents and CPS, et cetera, when there isn't a specific right for a youth to consent to their own treatment. So, this can be a real barrier as well. So since we're, short on time here, I'm just going to wrap up. I know we went through a lot in a short amount of time. I don't think that any of these things, though, would be at all unfamiliar to anyone who has had experience in the system. So one thing that we think about is like this story touches on so many different laws, policies, and systems. How do we sort them out and make them better? One thing that we've been working with at the Law Center is a framework that Away Home America has developed, where we get really clear about whether we're talking about reform efforts, whether we're talking about like the transformative edge of reform efforts, so kind of pushing the edge of what's possible under our current system, or whether we're talking about like a true transformation of a system. And I'll talk a little bit about practically like what each of those buckets would mean for Summer's story. But I think it's really important. And for a long time, a lot of us have not been very clear about like, if we're saying, a state should have an emancipation process, like that's a reform effort, right? Like just emancipating a youth does not solve the problem of what leads youth, into homelessness, what causes, poverty and breakdowns of family systems and, inability to access healthcare. That really truly is something that's reform. So while we think it could be useful for a state to implement an emancipation process, it's not going to solve the whole problem. So when we talk about reform efforts, like how do we make the situation slightly better for summer? If we had more time, I would have people, put their ideas in the chat. You are welcome to, because I will save the chat from this webinar so that we have it. So feel free to throw your own in, but these were some of the ones that I, thought of, which was allow there to be like a delay of notification so that when summer shows up with Buddy, like they don't have to call, Summer's parents right away or the police or CPS. Having low barrier shelters that allow pets and are inclusive of all genders. Of course, that can often be a problem. Like if it's a shelter that's, a women's shelter or a men's shelter, and, leaving youth who don't identify in that way with nowhere to go. Making sure that housing programs are actually housing first, like deal with warrants, ID, etc., after providing housing. Don't require it before. Allowing youth to consent to their own health care, mental health care, gender affirming care, reproductive health care, and then preventative health care. Many states don't even allow youth to they could consent maybe to like some kind of emergency health care, but they can't consent to their own like preventative care, just seeing a primary care doctor. And then add an exemption for unhoused youth for curfew laws. These are all things that we would say fall within reform. If we're looking more though at like transformation or transformative edge, like please also feel free to throw things in the chat. But one way that we could make this actually better for summer, like no wrong door, right? All services and programs are accessible, and they're accessible via trusted community-based organizations. You don't have to engage with child welfare, child protective services, the police, or the juvenile legal system to actually access services. These services, all services should be available to youth no matter how they come in contact with organizations that can help. We can talk about things like a guaranteed income for youth and young adults. There's a bunch of pilots going on about this across the country. This is something that anytime we meet with advocates in different states that we are pushing, like don't make youth go to their state agency to apply for like a small amount of benefits based on their income or things like that. You want to just have a system where youth just get income monthly, no matter what, so that wealth can be built and youth can become stable. We want to have lots of housing options and empower youth to be able to consent to housing, whether or not they're emancipated. And we talked a little bit about host homes, kinship care, all sorts of things. Kinship care should include like close friends, family friends, chosen family. And then another transformative, effort would be something like zero youth detention. Like, let's just eliminate detention for youth. There needs to be other solutions for youth that find themselves involved in the criminal or juvenile legal system. Great. And so I am going to wrap that up because we are at time. But please, if you have any other thoughts, we can hang out for a few more minutes in the chat for any questions. This is recorded, and we will share the PowerPoint, we'll share the recording with all of you after the presentation. But I will stop my screen share right now so that everyone, if there's anyone that has final questions, we'll be happy to take them. But otherwise, we could wrap it up and say happy holidays to you all. Right. Looks like some people are heading out. Thank you all. So glad to have you here. So great to have youth with us from so many different states. We look forward to connecting with you and working with you on the future on the state index and on advocacy efforts. Feel free to reach out to us if you have things you're working on in your state that you could use some support from the National Homelessness Law Center or True Colors United. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon and talk to you soon.
PowerPoint and video will be out to those who attended. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you all. Thanks, Amy, for running this webinar. We appreciate you.
Double shout out to Amy for running this webinar.
Yes. All right. Bye, friends.